The silence in my apartment felt heavier than usual that December morning. 9 years. 9 years since I walked away from the Kingdom Hall for the last time, since I chose truth over comfort, authenticity over acceptance. 9 years of birthdays celebrated in solitude, holidays acknowledged only by the commercial world around me, Christmas mornings that passed like any other Tuesday, each one a reminder of what I had lost and what I had gained. But this morning was different. Not because anything had changed in my circumstances, but because something had shifted inside me. Maybe it was the podcast I had been listening to lately, stories from others who had walked the same painful path out of the organization. Voices that echoed my own experience, people who understood the unique trauma of losing everything you were raised to believe was your identity. Maybe it was the therapist who finally helped me understand that the weight I carried wasn't shame, it was grief. Complex grief for a life that never truly existed, for a family that loved conditionally, for a community that demanded conformity above compassion. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in with memories I usually kept at bay. 23 years of my life had been spent in that organization, from birth until my 23rd birthday when I finally found the courage to walk away. 23 years of being told that questioning was dangerous, that doubt was spiritual weakness, that the outside world was filled with people who would destroy my faith and lead me to ruin. Christmas morning used to mean field service, going door to door while other families gathered around trees and opened gifts. We were special, we were different, we were the only ones who understood that December 25th was just another day corrupted by pagan traditions. How proud we were of our resistance to worldly celebrations, how superior we felt in our spiritual purity. I remembered the smug satisfaction of knocking on doors Christmas morning, watching through windows as families inside shared moments of joy we had been taught to view as spiritually contaminated. The irony of my position now wasn't lost on me. I had spent my childhood pitying the worldly people who celebrated holidays, convinced that their happiness was shallow and temporary, that only we possessed the truth that would lead to eternal life. Now I was more alone on Christmas morning than any of those worldly people I had once felt sorry for, sitting in an apartment that had become both sanctuary and prison, free from the organization's control but isolated from the family that had raised me. My phone buzzed against the coffee table, cutting through the mental fog that always seemed thicker on holidays. Unknown number. My finger hovered over the decline button. Unknown numbers these days were either telemarketers trying to sell me something I didn't need, or people from my past I wasn't emotionally prepared to face. The Judicial Committee had made it clear 9 years ago that any contact from family would be conditional on my repentance, my return to the fold. I had chosen intellectual honesty over familial love, and the price had been steeper than I ever imagined possible. The organization's shunning policy was designed to be psychological torture, and it was devastatingly effective. It wasn't just losing contact with family members, it was the systematic erasure of your entire social network, your support system, your sense of belonging in the world. Everyone you had ever been close to, every friend you had made, every person who had witnessed your life from childhood to adulthood, all of them were instructed to treat you as if you had died. Not just to avoid you, but to actively pretend you didn't exist. But something made me answer that call. Maybe it was the particular quality of loneliness that Christmas morning brings, the kind that makes you desperate enough to take any human connection, even if it might bring pain. Maybe it was the fact that I had been working with my therapist on being more open to possibilities, on not assuming the worst in every situation. Or maybe it was simply that after 9 years of silence, I was finally ready to hear whatever voice might be on the other end. Hello? My voice sounded rusty from hours of silence, rough around the edges like I hadn't used it in days. Sarah? The voice was trembling, barely above a whisper, but I recognized it immediately. My heart stopped, then started again in double time, the blood rushing in my ears so loudly I could barely hear her next words. Melissa? My younger sister. 7 years younger, which meant she had been only 19 when I was disfellowshipped. 19 and still living at home, still completely dependent on our parents, still deeply embedded in the organization that had raised us both. She had been in the Kingdom Hall that night when the announcement was made, sitting in the fourth row where our family always sat, when my name was read from the platform and every person I had ever loved was instructed to treat me as if I were dead. I had seen her face in my nightmares for years after that night. The confusion, the pain, the way she had started to stand up when my name was announced, probably to run to me, before our mother's hand had pulled her back down into her seat. The last time I had seen my sister, she had been crying silently while our father explained to her why she could never speak to me again, why loving me now meant shunning me, why this cruelty was actually an act of love designed to bring me back to the truth. Sarah, She was crying now, the sound cutting through me like broken glass, each sob hitting a nerve I thought had been permanently severed. I know I'm not supposed to call. I know what the elders say, what mom and dad say, what the organization says, but I can't. I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend you're dead when you're not. I can't pretend I don't think about you every single day. The words came tumbling out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for 9 years and they were finally breaking free like water through a burst dam. She told me about the weight of the shunning, how it had felt like carrying stones in her chest every day since that announcement. She told me about the questions that had started small but grown impossible to ignore, about research she had done in secret using private browser windows and deleted search histories, about the doubts that had been eating away at her faith like water slowly carving through stone. The questions had started during the pandemic, she explained, when the meetings moved online and she suddenly had access to a computer without constant supervision. She had started with innocent searches about the organization's history, trying to understand why certain things were taught the way they were. But the internet had shown her information that contradicted everything she had been taught, documentation that proved the organization had been wrong about major teachings multiple times, evidence of cover-ups and scandals that had never been mentioned from the platform. I found your blog, she whispered, and I felt my world tilt on its axis. The blog I had started 3 years ago, writing under a pseudonym, sharing my story and connecting with others who had walked away from high-control religious groups. I had never imagined anyone from my former life would find it, would recognize my voice through the careful anonymity I maintained. I had written under the name Robin, partly because of a story I had once told Melissa about birds being the first to sing at dawn, and partly because it felt like I was announcing a new day in my own life. I read everything, she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Every post, every comment. And Sarah, there are so many of us. So many people who have left, who have gone through exactly what we've gone through. I'm not alone in these doubts, and neither are you. There are thousands of people out there who have survived this, who have built new lives, who have found happiness after leaving. She had been following my blog for 8 months, she told me, reading every update, every story I shared about my journey of healing and recovery. She had created a fake email address to comment occasionally, asking questions that I now realized had been too specific, too knowledgeable about the organization's inner workings to have come from someone who had never been a witness. She had been reaching out to me for months without me knowing it was her, testing the waters, trying to find the courage for this moment. The conversation lasted 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours of catching up on 9 lost years, of comparing notes on the manipulation we had both experienced, of processing together the complex grief that comes with losing everything you were taught to believe to find your worth. She told me about her job at the local hospital, how seeing suffering up close had made her question the organization's stance on blood transfusions, how watching families torn apart by shunning policies had made her wonder if love was really supposed to be so conditional. She described watching children die because their parents refused blood transfusions, holding the hands of mothers who lost babies due to policies created by men who had never worked in medicine, never seen the real-world consequences of their theological positions. She told me about the cognitive dissonance of going to meetings 3 times a week where she was told that these policies showed Jehovah's love, while spending her workdays seeing the devastating results of those same policies. I told her about my journey out, about the panic attacks that had started when I first began questioning, about the therapy that had helped me understand that my entire identity had been constructed around pleasing people who would never be pleased, around achieving a perfection that was designed to be impossible to reach. I told her about the slow process of rebuilding an identity that wasn't dependent on the approval of 8 men in New York I had never met, men who claimed to speak for God but whose teachings kept changing with each new edition of their publications. I described the freedom I had found in authentic relationships, the joy of celebrating holidays because I chose to rather than because I was commanded to or forbidden from doing so. I told her about learning to trust my own moral compass, about discovering that the outside world wasn't filled with evil people trying to destroy my faith, but with ordinary humans living ordinary lives, many of them kinder and more genuine than the people I had known in the organization. "I want to see you," she said finally, her voice stronger now, more resolved. "I know it's risky, I know what it could mean if they find out, but Sarah, I can't lose you again. I already lost you once, and it nearly broke me. I've been grieving you for 9 years while you were still alive, and I can't do it anymore." The risk was real and we both knew it. If anyone from the congregation saw us together, if word got back to the elders, Melissa could face her own judicial committee, her own disfellowshipping. The organization's rules were clear: associating with a disfellowshipped person, especially a family member who wasn't living in the same household, was grounds for disciplinary action. She could lose everything I had lost, face the same isolation, the same systematic destruction of her social world. But she had already made her decision. She had been planning this call for months, she told me, working up the courage, researching what happened to people who left, building up her knowledge about the organization's history and policies until she couldn't unsee what she had learned. She was ready to take the risk because living without me had become more painful than the possibility of losing everything else. We agreed to meet the next week at a coffee shop 2 towns over, somewhere we were unlikely to run into anyone from the congregation. The conversation ended with promises to stay in touch, to be careful, to take things slowly. But as I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 9 years. Hope. The next few days passed in a blur of nervous anticipation mixed with a joy I hadn't felt since childhood. I found myself checking my phone constantly, half expecting a message saying she had changed her mind, that the fear had won out over the longing for connection. But each day brought small texts, little updates about her day, pictures of her cats, questions about my life that no one had asked me in nearly a decade. She told me about her apartment, her first place living alone, decorated with plants and books and art she had chosen herself rather than the neutral, spiritually safe decorations that had filled our childhood home. She described her co-workers at the hospital, people who had become something like friends despite the organization's warnings about forming close relationships with worldly people. She was already living a double life, she realized, already violating the organization's rules in small ways that had prepared her for this larger rebellion. The coffee shop meeting was surreal. Seeing her face across the table, older now, marked by years I hadn't been present for, felt like looking at a ghost that had suddenly become solid. The 19-year-old girl I remembered had become a 28-year-old woman, with lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and sorrow, but also with a strength in her posture that I didn't remember from before. She had grown into her own person during the years we had been apart, developed opinions and interests that had nothing to do with the organization's approved activities. She told me about books she had read in secret, movies she had watched on her laptop with headphones, music she had discovered that went beyond the kingdom songs we had been raised on. She had been expanding her world gradually, testing the boundaries, discovering that the outside world wasn't the spiritually dangerous place she had been taught to fear. But as we talked, the ghost became real again, became my sister again. The fundamental connection between us, the shared experiences of growing up in the same unusual household, the inside jokes and family stories that no one else would ever understand, all of that was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. We slipped back into the easy rhythm of sisterly conversation as if 9 years hadn't passed, as if we had never been forced apart. She had brought something with her, a small wrapped package that she pushed across the table with shaking hands. The wrapping paper was faded and creased, obviously old, handled many times over the years. "I've been carrying this for 9 years, she said, tears streaming down her face. "Mom made me promise to throw it away after the announcement. She said keeping it would be a sign that I wasn't accepting Jehovah's discipline, that I was clinging to someone who had chosen to reject the truth. But I couldn't. I hid it in my room and I've moved it with me to 3 different apartments, and I've kept it because I always hoped someday I would get to give it to you. My hands were shaking as I unwrapped it. Inside the preserved wrapping paper was a small white box, the kind that usually held jewelry. Inside that was a silver bracelet with a small charm shaped like a bird. A robin, I realized, and the memory came flooding back with such force that I had to catch my breath. When we were children, maybe 8 and 15, we had been walking to a meeting one early morning when she had commented on a bird singing in a tree outside the Kingdom Hall. I had told her that robins were special because they were the first birds to sing in the morning, the ones who announced that the dark night was over and a new day was beginning. She had loved that story, asked me to tell it to her again and again, started looking for robins everywhere we went. "You told me once that I was like a robin," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the coffee shop. "That I brought light into dark places, that I helped people see beauty even when things were difficult. But Sarah, you were wrong. You were the robin. You were the one who sang first, who had the courage to announce that a new day was coming. I just took 9 years to hear the song." The bracelet felt warm in my hands, heavier than it should have been for such a small piece of jewelry. But it wasn't just silver and metal I was holding. It was 9 years of love that had been suppressed but never destroyed, connection that had been severed but never truly broken. It was proof that even the most sophisticated systems of control couldn't completely kill the bonds between people who truly care about each other. Melissa told me that she had bought the bracelet for my 24th birthday, planning to give it to me that year as a symbol of everything she couldn't say out loud, a secret way of telling me that I had inspired her to think differently about the world. But my disfellowshipping had happened 3 months before my birthday, and she had been forbidden from giving me any gifts, from acknowledging my birthday at all. She described the pain of that day, having the gift wrapped and ready, wanting desperately to reach out to me but being told that any contact would be a betrayal of Jehovah, a sign of spiritual weakness. Our mother had found the gift while cleaning Melissa's room and had demanded that she throw it away, said that keeping anything intended for me would be like keeping a memorial to someone who had chosen spiritual death. But she had hidden it instead, moving it from place to place, carrying it like a secret talisman of hope. Every time she had been tempted to throw it away, to accept the organization's teaching that I was better off dead to them than alive and questioning, she had held on to it instead. It had become a symbol of her own doubts, proof that she wasn't as convinced as she pretended to be that shunning was really an act of love. We spent the afternoon walking through the town, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding the relationship that the organization had tried to kill. She told me about other family members who had expressed doubts privately, about cousins and aunts who had asked about me over the years, who had been shut down by the elders but never stopped wondering how I was doing, whether I was happy, whether I had found peace in my choice. Our cousin Jennifer had apparently been asking about me for years, wondering if I was okay, if I had anywhere to live, if I needed help. She had been told repeatedly that any interest in my welfare was inappropriate, that Jehovah would take care of me if I deserved it, that her concern for me showed a lack of faith in the organization's wisdom. But the concern had never gone away, and Melissa thought Jennifer might be ready to hear that I was not only surviving but thriving. There was our Aunt Patricia, who had always been the rebel of the family, who had married someone outside the organization and had been grudgingly accepted back when he studied and got baptized. She had been asking harder questions lately, Melissa told me, challenging some of the organization's teachings during family gatherings, pointing out inconsistencies and contradictions that the family had been trained to ignore. "There's a whole network of us," Melissa explained as we sat on a bench in the town square, watching normal families enjoy a normal Saturday afternoon. "People who are still in but questioning, people who have left but are afraid to speak up, people who love someone who has been shunned and hate themselves for following the rules. We're all carrying pieces of each other's pain, all wondering if we're the only ones who see the problems, all afraid to speak up because the cost is so high." As the sun began to set, we made plans for the future. Careful plans, because the risk was real and we both understood the potential consequences. If the wrong person saw us together, if word got back to the elders, Melissa could face her own judicial committee, her own disfellowshipping. The organization's surveillance culture meant that any member could be watching, could be reporting back to the leadership about who was seen with whom, who was asking the wrong questions, who was showing insufficient loyalty to the organization's rules. But the alternative, continuing to live as if I were dead, had become unbearable for both of us. We agreed to meet regularly but discreetly, to use encrypted messaging apps, to be careful about when and where we saw each other. We would build our relationship slowly, test the boundaries gradually, see how much contact we could maintain without triggering the organization's disciplinary machinery. I might not be ready to leave entirely, she admitted as we hugged goodbye in the parking lot, both of us crying but trying to be quiet about it. The fear is still too strong, the programming too deep. I still have panic attacks when I think about losing everyone else, about being completely cut off from the family. But I can't pretend anymore that you don't exist, that the organization is right about everything, that love should have conditions attached to it. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the silence I had woken up to that morning. This was peaceful quiet, the quiet of someone who had been holding their breath for 9 years and could finally exhale. The bracelet sat on my wrist like a gentle weight, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I had believed, that love had survived even when it had been forced underground. That night, I sat down at my computer and began to write. Not a blog post this time, but an email to the other ex-members I had connected with over the years. I told them about Melissa, about the gift, about the hope that had been rekindled in my chest like a small flame that refused to be extinguished no matter how many times the organization had tried to snuff it out. The responses started coming within hours, and what I found was extraordinary. Story after story of similar reunions, of family members who had secretly maintained contact, of love that had survived even the most determined attempts to kill it. A woman named Patricia in Oregon whose mother had been secretly sending birthday cards for 15 years, hiding them inside other mail so they wouldn't be discovered by the father who was an elder and would have reported his own wife for violating the shunning rules. There was Michael in Texas whose brother had created a fake social media account just to stay connected to his nephew's life, watching the boy grow up through carefully cropped photos that didn't show faces, sending anonymous gifts that arrived without return addresses. A grandmother named Ruth in Florida who had been putting money in a savings account for the grandchildren she wasn't allowed to see, hoping someday to give them the inheritance she had been accumulating, the college funds their parents would never allow them to have. Each story was different in its details but identical in its core truth. Love doesn't disappear because an organization commands it to. Connection doesn't die because men in suits declare it dead. The human heart is more resilient than any doctrine designed to control it, more persistent than any policy designed to break it. The emails kept coming for days, each one adding another layer to my understanding of how widespread this secret network of resistance really was. There were still active members who were secretly helping their disfellowshipped children, elders who were turning a blind eye to their wives' violations of the shunning rules, young people who were planning their exits but maintaining their facades until they could afford to lose everything. Most surprising of all were the messages from people who had never left but who were living double lives, attending meetings and going through the motions while privately researching the organization's history, secretly reading books and websites that the organization had forbidden, gradually coming to understand that they had been lied to about almost everything they had been taught to believe. Over the following months, what started as secret meetings with Melissa grew into something larger and more organized. She introduced me to our cousin Jennifer, who had indeed been questioning for years and was relieved to discover that her concerns were shared by others. Jennifer brought along a friend from another congregation named David who had similar doubts, who had been struggling with the organization's policies on homosexuality after his own son had come out to him in private. David brought his wife Sarah, who had been doing her own secret research into the organization's history of failed predictions and changing doctrines. Sarah brought her sister Lisa, who had been troubled by the organization's handling of child abuse cases after her own daughter had disclosed abuse by a ministerial servant who was still serving in the congregation because there hadn't been a second witness to corroborate the child's testimony. Lisa brought her husband Tom, who was an accountant and had been horrified by the organization's financial secrecy and the luxurious lifestyle of the governing body members while local congregations struggled to pay for basic maintenance. Tom brought a co-worker named James who had been studying with the witnesses but had started asking questions that his study conductor couldn't answer, questions about the organization's history that had been carefully hidden from new converts. Within 6 months, our little group had grown to 15 people in various stages of questioning, leaving, or secretly maintaining minimal involvement while building new lives outside the organization's control. We started meeting regularly in the back room of a restaurant whose owner was himself an ex-member of a different high-control religious group and understood the need for privacy and security. We called ourselves a support group, but we were really functioning more like a family. We shared resources for those wanting to research the organization's history, provided emotional support for those in various stages of questioning or leaving, helped people find therapists who understood religious trauma, and most importantly, we proved to each other that life after the organization wasn't just possible but could be beautiful. The bracelet became a symbol for our little group. Not everyone wore one, but the robin became our unofficial mascot, representing the courage to sing first, to announce that dawn was breaking even when the world around you insisted it was still night. Some members had robin tattoos, others carried small robin charms in their pockets, a few had robin artwork in their homes as a reminder that they weren't alone in their journey toward freedom. Our meetings followed a loose structure that had evolved organically over time. We would start with a check-in, each person sharing how their week had gone, what challenges they were facing, what victories they had achieved in their journey toward authenticity. Then we would have an educational component, where someone would present research about the organization's history, or a mental health professional would talk about recovery from religious trauma, or we would watch a documentary about high-control groups. The final part of each meeting was what we called action planning, where people would share their goals for the coming week, whether that was having a difficult conversation with a family member, applying for a job that would require working during meeting times, celebrating a birthday for the first time, or simply reading a book that the organization had forbidden. We would strategize together about how to handle challenges, share resources and referrals, and make sure everyone had the support they needed to take their next steps toward freedom. Some members of our group left the organization entirely, facing their own disfellowshipping with the knowledge that they weren't alone in the aftermath. Others chose to fade slowly, gradually reducing their involvement while maintaining minimal contact to preserve family relationships that couldn't survive complete separation. A few decided to stay but with completely different perspectives, viewing the organization as a social club rather than the sole source of truth they had once believed it to be. There was no judgment in our group for any of these choices. We had all learned the hard way what it felt like to have our life paths dictated by others, to be told that there was only one right way to live, one acceptable way to believe, one proper relationship with spirituality and community. The freedom to choose our own relationship with faith, family, and community was sacred to us, and we protected each other's right to make different choices even when we might have chosen differently ourselves. As winter turned to spring, Melissa began talking more seriously about leaving entirely. The cognitive dissonance had become too painful, the gap between what she was taught and what she experienced too wide to bridge. She had started therapy with a counselor who specialized in religious trauma, begun the slow process of rebuilding her identity outside the organization's framework. She described the experience as feeling like she was learning to walk again, discovering that she had been relying on crutches that had actually been keeping her from developing her own strength. Every decision she had made for 28 years had been filtered through the organization's rules and expectations. Now she was learning to trust her own judgment, to develop her own moral compass, to make choices based on her own values rather than someone else's interpretation of ancient texts. I keep thinking about that Christmas morning, she told me one afternoon as we sat in what had become our regular coffee shop, a place that now held so many memories of healing and reconnection. How lonely you must have been, how dark everything must have felt. But you answered the phone anyway. You took the risk of connecting with me even though you had no idea how it would turn out. I thought about that morning often too, about the particular quality of silence that had filled my apartment, about the moment I chose to answer an unknown call rather than let it go to voicemail. Such a small decision, but it had changed everything. Not just for me, but for Melissa, and through her for dozens of other people who had found their way to our support group, who had discovered that they weren't alone in their doubts and questions. "You know what I learned?" I told her, turning the robin bracelet on my wrist, feeling its familiar weight. Isolation is the organization's most powerful weapon. When they can convince us that we're alone in our doubts, that everyone who leaves is bitter and lost and miserable, they can keep us trapped. But when we connect with each other, when we share our stories and realize how many of us there are, the spell breaks. The spell was breaking for more people every month. Our support group had spawned 3 other groups in nearby cities, all of them following the same model of education, emotional support, and action planning. We had created a private online forum where people could connect anonymously, share resources, ask questions without fear of being reported to the elders. The coffee shop had become our sanctuary, but it was also becoming too small for our growing network. We started looking for a larger space, somewhere we could host workshops and book clubs and holiday celebrations for those who wanted to experience what they had been denied for so many years. We found a small community center that was available for rental, a space that could accommodate up to 50 people and had the privacy and security we needed. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were essentially creating our own congregation, our own community of believers. But this time, we were believing in each other rather than in an organization. We were believing in the possibility of love without conditions, truth without punishment, community without control. We were believing in the human capacity for growth and change, for healing and transformation, for creating meaning and purpose without requiring anyone else's permission or approval. Our first workshop was on the subject of holiday celebrations, led by a woman named Carol who had been out of the organization for 12 years and had become an expert on creating new traditions while honoring your own journey. She taught us about the difference between rebellion and authenticity, between doing things to spite your former community and doing things because they brought you joy. The second workshop was on financial planning for people leaving high-control groups, led by Tom the accountant who understood both the practical challenges of building financial independence and the emotional challenges of making decisions that had been made for your entire life. He helped people create budgets that accounted for the loss of family financial support, plan for education and career development that had been discouraged by the organization, and understand the financial implications of being disfellowshipped. We had workshops on dating and relationships for people who had never been allowed to form romantic connections outside the organization, on parenting for people who wanted to raise children differently than they had been raised, on education and career development for people who had been discouraged from pursuing higher education or worldly success. Each workshop filled up within hours of being announced, and we started getting requests from people in other states who wanted to attend virtually or start similar programs in their own areas. The hunger for this kind of support and community was enormous, and we were barely scratching the surface of the need. When Christmas came around again, 11 months after that life-changing phone call, I wasn't alone. Melissa was there, along with 37 other people who had become family in the truest sense of the word. We had rented the community center for the evening and decorated it not with religious symbols but with symbols of hope and new beginnings. Robins, butterflies, sunrise imagery, plants and flowers that represented growth and renewal. We exchanged gifts and told stories and sang songs, not because we were trying to rebel against our former faith but because we were celebrating our freedom to choose joy. The gifts were meaningful rather than expensive, books that had been important in someone's journey, artwork created by members of the group, plants propagated from gardens that represented new life taking root. I wore the robin bracelet that day, feeling its weight on my wrist like a reminder of how far we had all come. In the center of the room, we had placed a small tree decorated with birds of all kinds. Robins, cardinals, blue jays, owls, hawks, doves. Each one representing a different member of our growing community, a different voice in our choir of survivors who had become thrivers. The evening included a storytelling session where people shared their own versions of the Christmas morning phone call, the moment when they had chosen connection over isolation, authenticity over conformity, love over fear. There was the woman whose daughter had contacted her after 15 years of shunning, the man whose brother had shown up at his workplace just to say he was sorry for treating him like he was dead, the teenager whose grandmother had secretly given her college money and told her to pursue her dreams regardless of what the organization taught about worldly education. Each story was unique, but they all shared the same theme: love is stronger than doctrine, connection is more powerful than control, and the human spirit is more resilient than any system designed to break it. We were living proof that it was possible to survive and thrive after losing everything you had been taught to believe defined your worth. As evening fell and people began to leave, heading back to their own homes and their own families, both biological and chosen, Melissa lingered behind to help clean up. We worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes between people who have shared their deepest fears and found acceptance rather than judgment, who have supported each other through the hardest parts of rebuilding their lives. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly, pausing in her collection of wrapping paper and ribbons. "Leaving, I mean. Losing the family we grew up with, the community that raised us, all the certainty we used to have about everything. Sometimes I wonder if ignorance really was bliss, if it would have been easier to just keep believing what we were taught." I considered the question seriously. It wasn't the first time someone had asked me this, and it probably wouldn't be the last. The cost of leaving had been enormous, the grief sometimes overwhelming. There were still days when I missed the simplicity of having all my decisions made for me, when I envied people who had never had to question everything they believed, who had never had to rebuild their entire identity from scratch. But as I looked around the room where love had been freely given and received, where questions were welcomed rather than feared, where authenticity was valued over conformity, where people were encouraged to think for themselves rather than simply obey, I knew my answer with complete certainty. "I regret the loss," I said finally, sitting down on one of the folding chairs we had been stacking. "I regret that they chose conditional love over unconditional acceptance. I regret that fear won out over curiosity, that control was valued more than connection. I regret the years we lost, the relationships that were destroyed, the pain that so many people have had to endure. But I don't regret choosing truth, even when it was painful. I don't regret choosing authenticity, even when it was lonely. And I definitely don't regret answering that phone call." Melissa smiled, the kind of smile that reaches all the way to the eyes, the kind that carries no shadow of doubt or fear. "I'm glad you did too. Because look what grew from that one moment of courage. Look what bloomed from that one choice to connect rather than hide." She was right. What had started as a desperate phone call on a lonely Christmas morning had become a movement, a network, a new kind of family. We had taken the pain of our shared experience and transformed it into purpose. We had taken the isolation that was meant to break us and used it to build bridges to each other. We had taken the silence that was supposed to be our punishment and filled it with new voices, new songs, new stories of hope and healing. As I locked up the community center that night, I thought about all the other people out there who might be sitting in silence, convinced they were alone in their doubts, isolated by an organization that equated questioning with betrayal. I thought about the families torn apart by shunning, the individuals struggling with cognitive dissonance, the young people facing the impossible choice between authenticity and acceptance. Our little group had started a website that was now getting thousands of visitors per month, sharing resources and stories, providing a lifeline for those who were drowning in the kind of darkness I remembered so well. We had created a podcast that was being downloaded in over 40 countries, broadcasting hope into the void, proving that life after high-control religion wasn't just survival but could be transformation and joy. The podcast had become particularly successful, with episodes featuring interviews with mental health professionals who specialized in religious trauma, former members of various high-control groups sharing their stories, and practical advice for people in different stages of questioning or leaving. We had episodes on everything from how to build a resume when you had never been allowed to pursue higher education, to how to celebrate holidays for the first time, to how to have difficult conversations with family members who were still in the organization. But the most popular episodes were the simple storytelling ones, where people shared their own versions of the Christmas morning phone call, their own moments of choosing connection over isolation. These stories seemed to resonate with people around the world who had experienced similar losses, similar struggles with high-control groups of all kinds. The robin bracelet caught the light from the parking lot lamp as I walked to my car, and I thought about symbols and their power. For so many years, the symbols in my life had been about restriction, control, separation from the world. The Kingdom Hall with its windowless walls designed to keep the outside world out, the Watchtower publications with their dire warnings about thinking independently, the meeting clothes that marked us as different and special and apart from normal human community. Now my symbols were about connection, freedom, the courage to sing a new song even when the old hymns still echoed in my head. The robin reminded me daily that dawn always comes, that spring always follows winter, that hope is always possible even in the darkest moments. It reminded me that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is simply answer the phone when an unknown number calls. Driving home through the quiet streets, I realized that I had found something the organization had promised but never delivered. I had found genuine community, the kind based on mutual support rather than mutual surveillance. I had found unconditional love, the kind that didn't require perfect obedience or unquestioning loyalty. I had found a sense of purpose that didn't depend on the approval of others, work that felt meaningful because it helped people heal rather than controlled them. Most importantly, I had found peace. Not the artificial peace that comes from having all your questions answered and all your decisions made for you, but the real peace that comes from learning to live with uncertainty, from accepting that growth requires questioning, from understanding that love worth having is love that can survive disagreement and change. The apartment I returned to that night was the same one I had woken up in almost exactly a year earlier, but it felt completely different. It was no longer a place of isolation but a sanctuary, no longer a hiding place but a launching pad. The silence wasn't empty anymore but full, pregnant with possibility and connection and hope. I sat down at my computer and began to write, not for the blog this time but for the book I had been working on for months. The story of how a single phone call had changed everything, how love had survived despite every attempt to kill it, how a community of survivors had become a family of thrivers, how isolation had been transformed into connection. The book would be called Answer the Call, Finding Community After Leaving a High-Control Group, and it would tell not just my story but the stories of dozens of people who had found their way from isolation to connection, from despair to hope, from survival to transformation. It would be a practical guide for people leaving high-control groups, but also a testament to the power of human resilience and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. The first sentence came easily, flowing from my fingers like water that had been dammed up too long and was finally free to run toward the sea. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than usual that December morning. And as I wrote, I could almost hear them singing. All the robins who had found their voices, all the dawn songs being sung by people who had finally found the courage to announce that the long night was over and a new day had begun. I could hear the voices of people in support group meetings around the country, sharing their stories and finding healing in community. I could hear the podcast listeners who sent emails describing how our stories had given them hope, had helped them feel less alone in their struggles. The bracelet glinted on my wrist in the lamplight, a small silver reminder that some gifts are worth waiting 9 years to receive, that some connections survive even the most determined attempts to sever them, that some kinds of love are stronger than any doctrine designed to destroy them. It reminded me that every phone call answered is a choice for connection over isolation, every story shared is a victory over the silence that high-control groups use as a weapon. This was my Christmas story, my resurrection narrative, my testament to the power of human connection to overcome even the most sophisticated systems of control. But it was more than that now. It had become our story, the story of everyone who had ever chosen truth over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, love over fear. It belonged to everyone who had ever answered a phone call from an unknown number and found their whole world changed by the voice on the other end. The story wasn't just mine anymore, and it wasn't just about ex-Jehovah's Witnesses anymore. It had become a universal story about the human capacity for healing, for growth, for creating new forms of family and community when the old ones fail us. It was about the courage required to live authentically in a world that often punishes authenticity, about the strength required to love unconditionally in communities that make love conditional. As I wrote through the night, I thought about all the people who would read this story, who would recognize themselves in it, who would find hope in knowing that they weren't alone in their struggles. I thought about the support groups that would form, the families that would reconnect, the individuals who would find the courage to choose authenticity over acceptance because they had read about others who had made that choice and survived. And it was just the beginning. The robin had sung her dawn song, and other birds were beginning to join the chorus. The long night was ending, and a new day was breaking for everyone who had the courage to listen, to answer when connection called, to believe that love could survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it. The bracelet caught the morning light as the sun began to rise outside my window, and I smiled, thinking about Melissa waking up in her own apartment, probably wearing her own robin charm, probably thinking about the community we had built together from the ashes of the family we had lost. We had created something beautiful from something broken, something life-giving from something that was designed to bring death. The phone call had been answered. The gift had been given and received. The story had been told and retold until it became not just our story but everyone's story, a reminder that love finds a way, that connection survives, that hope endures even in the darkest silence. And somewhere, in apartments and houses and coffee shops around the world, other phones were ringing, other voices were calling out across the void, other robins were finding the courage to sing their dawn songs. The new day had begun. 6 months later, I received an email that would change everything again. It came from a woman named Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a professor of psychology at a major university who had been researching the psychological effects of religious shunning. She had come across our podcast and was amazed by the depth of healing and community building we had achieved. She wanted to collaborate on a formal research study that would document the effectiveness of peer support groups for people recovering from religious trauma. The study would involve following our group members over 2 years, measuring their progress on various psychological wellness indicators, and comparing their outcomes to people who had left high-control groups but hadn't found community support. The research would be groundbreaking, the first of its kind to scientifically document what we already knew in our hearts: connection heals, community saves lives, and love really can triumph over the most sophisticated systems of psychological control. More importantly, Dr. Rodriguez explained, the study would provide the scientific credibility needed to expand our model nationwide. Universities would want to replicate our approach, mental health professionals would have evidence-based protocols to follow, and funding would become available to support people leaving high-control groups in ways that had never been possible before. Melissa was the first person I called with the news. She had just submitted her own letter of disassociation to the elders, formally ending her membership in the organization after 28 years. The letter was carefully crafted, explaining her reasons without bitterness, expressing gratitude for the positive experiences while clearly stating that she could no longer support policies that separated families and discouraged independent thinking. "I never thought I would be brave enough," she told me, her voice steady and clear in a way I had never heard before. "But watching you, watching everyone in our group, seeing how much happier and more authentic we all became when we stopped pretending to believe things that didn't make sense. I realized that the fear of losing everything was nothing compared to the fear of losing myself." The response to her disassociation letter had been swift and predictable. Our parents had called to tearfully inform her that she was now dead to them, that they would be praying for Jehovah to help her come to her senses before Armageddon destroyed her along with all the other apostates and unbelievers. Cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends, everyone from her former life had immediately cut off all contact, following the organization's instructions to treat her as if she had never existed. But Melissa wasn't alone this time. She had our support group, she had me, she had the family we had built together from the pieces of the one that had been taken from us. She had a chosen family that loved her without conditions, that celebrated her courage rather than punishing her questions, that valued her authenticity more than her compliance. The hardest part, she confided during one of our evening walks, isn't losing them. It's realizing that I never really had them in the first place. Their love was always conditional on my belief, on my obedience, on my willingness to stay small and quiet and unquestioning. What we have now, what our group has, this is what real love actually looks like. The research study launched 6 months later with 43 participants from our original group and its 3 sister groups in nearby cities. Dr. Rodriguez and her team conducted comprehensive psychological assessments, measuring everything from symptoms of depression and anxiety to levels of life satisfaction, social connection, and personal agency. The preliminary results were extraordinary. Participants showed significant improvements in all measured areas within the first 6 months of joining our support groups. Depression scores dropped by an average of 60%, anxiety levels decreased by 45%, and measures of life satisfaction and personal empowerment increased dramatically. Most remarkably, these improvements appeared to be sustainable over time, with many participants showing continued growth and healing throughout the 2-year study period. The research attracted national attention. Mental health professionals began reaching out to learn about our model. Former members of other high-control groups asked for help starting similar communities in their areas, and academic conferences invited us to present our findings. What had started as a desperate phone call on Christmas morning had become a movement with scientific backing and national recognition. But the most meaningful validation came from the individual stories, the personal transformations we witnessed every week in our meetings. There was Jennifer, our cousin, who had started college at age 35 after being told her entire life that higher education was dangerous and unnecessary for women. She was now studying social work, planning to specialize in helping people recover from religious trauma. David, whose questioning had begun when his son came out as gay, had become an advocate for LGBTQ+ rights within religious communities. He traveled around the country speaking at conferences about the damage caused by religious homophobia and the possibility of creating faith communities that truly welcomed everyone. His relationship with his son had healed completely, and they now work together on advocacy projects. Lisa, whose daughter had been abused by a ministerial servant, had become a fierce advocate for child protection policies in religious organizations. She had testified before state legislatures about the need for mandatory reporting laws that didn't include religious exemptions, and her advocacy had contributed to new legislation in 3 states that strengthened protections for children in religious communities. Tom, the accountant who had been horrified by the organization's financial secrecy, had started a non-profit organization that provided financial literacy education and support for people leaving high-control groups. He understood that financial dependence was one of the most powerful tools these organizations use to maintain control, and he was determined to help people achieve the economic independence they needed to live authentically. Each member of our community had found their own way to transform their pain into purpose, their trauma into advocacy, their isolation into connection. The robin bracelet on my wrist had become more than a symbol of our bond. It was a reminder that from the darkest experiences can come the most powerful light, that the courage to sing a new song can inspire others to find their own voices. The second Christmas celebration of our community was even larger than the first, with over 80 people gathered in a rented hall that could accommodate our growing family. The decorations were more elaborate this time, with an entire wall dedicated to photos and stories from community members around the country who had started their own support groups using our model. The storytelling session that night included voices from across the continent. Through video calls, we heard from a former Mormon in Utah whose family had reconnected after 5 years of estrangement, a former Amish woman in Pennsylvania who had started the first support group for people leaving her community, and a former member of a fundamentalist Christian group in Texas who had become a therapist specializing in religious trauma recovery. Each story was different, but the themes were universal: the pain of losing everything you thought defined you, the terror of stepping into an unknown world, the gradual discovery that life outside the controlled community wasn't just possible but could be more beautiful than anything you had imagined. These were stories of resurrection, of rebirth, of phoenix rising from ashes. As I looked around the room that night, watching people who had once been isolated in their pain now surrounded by love and understanding, I felt a deep sense of completion. The scared, lonely woman who had answered an unknown phone call that Christmas morning had become someone she never could have imagined, a leader, an advocate, a voice for the voiceless, a bridge between the world she had lost and the world she had helped create. The bracelet glinted under the string lights as I raised my hand to get the room's attention for a final toast. "To the Robins," I said, my voice carrying across the room filled with faces that had become as dear to me as any biological family. To everyone who had the courage to sing first, to announce that dawn was breaking even when the world insisted it was still night. To the ones who answered the call, who chose connection over isolation, who proved that love is stronger than any doctrine designed to destroy it. The room erupted in applause, voices raised in agreement, hands reaching out to touch shoulders and squeeze hands in recognition of the bonds that connected us all. We were no longer just survivors, we were thrivers, builders, creators of new possibilities. We were living proof that the human spirit cannot be broken by any system designed to control it, that love finds a way to survive and flourish even in the most hostile environments. In that moment, surrounded by the family I had never known I was creating when I answered that phone call, I understood something profound about the nature of healing and hope. Sometimes the greatest tragedies in our lives become the foundation for the greatest triumphs. Sometimes the deepest pain opens us to the deepest joy. Sometimes the ending of one story is really the beginning of another, better story that we could never have written if we hadn't first been willing to let the old story die. The robin on my bracelet caught the light one more time as I lifted my glass, and I thought about all the dawn songs yet to be sung, all the new days yet to begin, all the unknown phone calls yet to be answered by people who were ready to choose connection over isolation, love over fear, hope over despair. The story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And somewhere out there, in the quiet of another Christmas morning, another phone might be ringing, another voice might be calling across the void, another person might be facing the choice between answering and hanging up, between connection and isolation, between the old life and the new one waiting to be born. When that moment comes, I hope they remember this story. I hope they remember that love survives, that healing is possible, that community can be rebuilt even from the ashes of the one that was lost. I hope they choose to answer the call.